Throughout history, one pattern appears again and again, quiet yet deeply unsettling. People endure systems that limit them, exploit them, silence them, and sometimes even harm them, and yet they defend those very systems. Workers defend economic structures that underpay them. Citizens defend political regimes that restrict their freedoms. Communities protect traditions that constrain their own potential. Entire populations rally behind institutions that fail them. At first glance, this behavior seems irrational. It seems contradictory. Why would anyone defend something that causes them pain? Why would individuals protect structures that reduce their opportunities, restrict their voices, or deny their dignity? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. The instinctive explanation is ignorance. Perhaps people simply do not understand the harm. But history shows that awareness often exists. Many individuals recognize inefficiency, corruption, inequality, or injustice within the systems they inhabit. They complain privately. They joke about dysfunction. They acknowledge flaws. And yet, when confronted publicly, they hesitate. They rationalize. They defend. This contradiction suggests that the issue is not a lack of intelligence. It is something deeper, something psychological. Human beings are not driven only by justice or logic. They are driven by stability, belonging, identity, and fear. A system, even an imperfect one, provides structure. It offers predictability. It defines roles. It organizes daily life. It tells people who they are and where they fit. When that structure is challenged, the threat feels existential. Criticizing a system is rarely just an intellectual act, it is an emotional risk. To question the foundation that shapes your life is to risk destabilizing your sense of certainty. There is also the power of gradual adaptation. Harm rarely arrives all at once. It creeps in slowly. Restrictions expand incrementally. Corruption normalizes quietly. Expectations lower over time. What would have provoked outrage a decade ago becomes tolerable today. The human mind is remarkably adaptive. It recalibrates. It adjusts standards. It tells itself that things could be worse. And in doing so, it transforms discomfort into routine. Belonging intensifies this process. Humans are social creatures. Isolation feels dangerous at a primal level. If the majority appears to support a system, dissent becomes lonely. Even when dissatisfaction is widespread, public silence creates the illusion of consensus. Each individual may privately doubt, yet assume others genuinely believe. This false perception strengthens conformity. To challenge the system then becomes not only a political act but a social risk. Identity deepens the attachment. Many systems are intertwined with national pride, religious belief, family tradition, or ideological commitment. To criticize them can feel like betraying one's heritage or community. Admitting that a system is flawed may imply that past sacrifices were misguided. It may force painful reflection on years of loyalty. The mind resists that discomfort. It prefers consistency over contradiction. Fear completes the structure. Not always fear of punishment, but fear of uncertainty. The unknown is psychologically heavier than the known, even when the known is harmful. An imperfect system is predictable. Change is not. People often calculate subconsciously, better the flawed stability I understand than the uncertain future I cannot control. Is this system stable? Stability reduces anxiety. Stability allows planning. Stability creates predictability. And predictability feels like safety. Even an imperfect structure can feel preferable to an uncertain alternative. The human brain evolved in environments where uncertainty often meant danger. A familiar hierarchy, even an unfair one, is easier to navigate than a chaotic vacuum. Justice is abstract. Stability is immediate. Justice promises moral alignment, stability promises tomorrow. When people defend harmful systems, they are often defending the only framework they know how to survive within. Change introduces risk. Risk threatens income, relationships, social belonging, and identity. The mind calculates subconsciously. Discomfort within a stable system may be painful, but total disruption may be catastrophic. That calculation is not necessarily noble, but it is deeply human. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. In many societies, populations tolerated corruption, inequality, or restriction not because they admired it, but because it maintained order. Order keeps markets functioning. Order keeps schools open. Order keeps routines intact. When faced with the possibility of upheaval, many individuals retreat toward caution. They may criticize quietly, but publicly they support continuity. Stability becomes morally elevated. It becomes framed as responsibility. Those who push for change are portrayed as reckless, dangerous, or naive. Justice becomes secondary to the preservation of structure. There is also a neurological component. Uncertainty activates stress responses. The brain seeks patterns and predictability to reduce cognitive strain. When a system, even a harmful one, provides consistent rules, individuals adapt to those rules. Adaptation reduces stress. Radical change removes familiar patterns and forces the brain into constant recalibration. This is exhausting. Over time, people may prefer enduring injustice over enduring instability because instability demands constant psychological adjustment. Stability also creates dependency. Jobs, social networks, education, and healthcare often depend on institutional continuity. If a system collapses abruptly, livelihoods collapse with it. People who are economically tied to the system have rational reasons to defend it. They may recognize its flaws but fear the consequences of its removal. Justice requires transition, and transition carries cost. Many individuals cannot afford that cost. Furthermore, stability carries symbolic meaning. It represents national survival, social coherence, and collective identity. Leaders often frame stability as patriotism. Criticism becomes equated with threat. In such contexts, defending the system feels like defending one's community. The language of justice is reframed as the language of risk. Those demanding reform are portrayed as destabilizing forces rather than moral correctives. Gradual harm intensifies this dynamic. If injustice arrives suddenly, outrage mobilizes quickly. But when restrictions or inequities expand incrementally, adaptation keeps pace. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes normalized. Stability remains intact while standards shift downward. The absence of dramatic collapse reinforces the perception that the system is still functioning. And if it functions, even imperfectly, many conclude that preservation is wiser than rupture. There is also a psychological comfort in believing that improvement can occur without dismantling structure. People tell themselves that reform is possible from within. They defend the broader system while criticizing specific elements. This allows them to maintain stability while preserving moral self-image. The system is flawed, they say, but it can be fixed. That belief postpones confrontation. It protects hope. It delays decisive action. The paradox is that prioritizing stability over justice can weaken long-term stability itself. Systems that suppress correction in the name of order accumulate hidden fragility. Silence replaces feedback. Fear replaces innovation. Compliance replaces engagement. Stability becomes surface level, a calm exterior covering structural stress. When change eventually arrives, it arrives abruptly, because underlying problems were never addressed. Yet from the individual perspective, the choice remains understandable. Humans seek safety first. Justice requires courage, coordination, and trust that others will act similarly. Stability requires only personal compliance. One is collective and risky, the other is individual and immediate. In environments where trust is low or fear is high, stability almost always wins. The enduring lesson is not that people are immoral. It is that survival instincts are powerful. When systems harm slowly while maintaining order, people adapt. They defend what they know. They protect the predictable. And they postpone justice until instability forces their hand. Structure il ingilisk. Identity trap, when criticizing the system feels like attacking yourself. Human beings do not attach themselves only to ideas. They attach themselves to identities. And once identity becomes intertwined with a system, political, religious, economic, or cultural, criticizing that system no longer feels like an intellectual act. It feels personal. This is the identity trap. A system may harm someone materially, restrict them socially, or disappoint them morally, yet they may still defend it fiercely. Not because they cannot see its flaws, but because rejecting it would feel like rejecting themselves. Identity is constructed through belonging. From childhood, individuals absorb narratives about who they are and what community they belong to. Nation, religion, ideology, family tradition, social class, these are not abstract categories. They are psychological anchors. They provide meaning, pride, and coherence. When a political system is deeply woven into those narratives, it becomes more than governance. It becomes a symbol of collective self-worth. To question it is to question one's own history, one's parents' sacrifices, one's community's legitimacy. Cognitive dissonance plays a crucial role in the identity trap. When evidence emerges that a system is corrupt, inefficient, or unjust, individuals experience tension between reality and self-concept. If I have believed for years that my country is morally superior, what does it mean if it commits injustice? If I have defended a particular ideology publicly, what does it mean if that ideology harms people? Admitting systemic failure threatens internal consistency. And the human mind values consistency highly. It will reinterpret facts, minimize problems, or rationalize harm in order to preserve a stable identity. The deeper the emotional investment, the stronger the defense. People who have sacrificed for a system, soldiers, party members, activists, loyal citizens, often struggle the most to detach from it. Their personal story is entangled with its story. If the system collapses morally or structurally, they must reevaluate their own past decisions. That reevaluation can feel humiliating or destabilizing. It is psychologically easier to defend the system than to confront the possibility that years of loyalty were misplaced. Identity traps are strengthened by social reinforcement. Communities often reward conformity and punish deviation. When belonging depends on visible loyalty, dissent becomes costly. Individuals fear social exclusion more than ideological inconsistency. Even subtle signals. Silence at gatherings, awkward conversations, loss of trust, can discourage criticism. As a result, people defend systems not only to protect internal identity but to preserve external relationships. National identity intensifies this effect. Nations are powerful emotional constructs. They combine language, history, shared trauma, and collective memory. If a political structure presents itself as the embodiment of the nation, challenging that structure feels like betrayal. Leaders often frame dissent as disloyalty precisely because it activates this identity trap. Criticism is recast as an attack on who we are. In such contexts, defending the system becomes synonymous with defending one's heritage. The trap also operates through pride. Superpower status, economic success, or historical achievement can become central to collective self-image. When flaws emerge, people instinctively protect that pride. They may downplay harm, blame external enemies, or focus on past victories. Pride resists vulnerability. And vulnerability is necessary for reform. Interestingly, the identity trap does not require complete belief. Individuals may privately doubt aspects of the system while publicly defending it. This split allows them to maintain social belonging while internally managing skepticism. Over time, however, repeated public defense can reinforce belief. Behavior shapes perception. If someone argues in favor of a system repeatedly, even strategically, they may begin to internalize that defense more deeply. Breaking the identity trap requires separating personal worth from structural allegiance. This is psychologically demanding. It requires humility and the capacity to hold complex truths simultaneously, to acknowledge belonging while recognizing flaw. Many systems discourage such nuance. They prefer binary loyalty. Either you support us fully or you oppose us entirely. Binary framing intensifies identity attachment and discourages reflection. The identity trap explains why harmful systems often persist even when evidence of harm is visible. People are not only evaluating policy, they are protecting self-concept. To admit systemic injustice may feel like admitting personal complicity. And guilt is harder to bear than denial. Ultimately, the identity trap reveals a profound human vulnerability. Our need for belonging can override our commitment to fairness. Systems that understand this do not merely enforce compliance, they cultivate emotional identification. When citizens internalize the system as part of themselves, defense becomes automatic. And this is why harmful systems endure not simply through coercion or propaganda, but through identity fusion. The more tightly a structure is woven into personal and collective identity, the harder it becomes to disentangle criticism from self-attack. Reform then requires not only structural change, but psychological courage, the courage to redefine who we are without losing who we have been. Harm rarely arrives with a loud announcement. It does not usually knock on the door in dramatic fashion and declare itself openly. Instead, it moves quietly. It adjusts slowly. It disguises itself as necessity, as temporary policy, as minor compromise. And because it does not shock the system all at once, it avoids resistance. Gradual normalization is the process through which what was once unacceptable becomes routine. It is not revolution in reverse, it is erosion. The human mind is remarkably adaptive. This adaptability is essential for survival. When environments change, we recalibrate. When circumstances worsen slightly, we adjust expectations. A small restriction feels inconvenient but tolerable. A minor injustice feels frustrating but manageable. If the change does not immediately threaten survival, the brain categorizes it as something to endure rather than something to fight. Over time, the threshold of what feels intolerable shifts downward. Consider how standards evolve. The first time a rule limits freedom, it sparks debate. The second time, it feels familiar. The third time, it becomes part of the background. Repetition reduces emotional response. What once provoked anger becomes normal conversation. This psychological desensitization is powerful. It does not require propaganda to succeed. It requires time. Gradual normalization also exploits comparison. People measure the present not against ideals but against yesterday. If yesterday was slightly worse than the day before, and today is only slightly worse than yesterday, the decline feels incremental rather than catastrophic. There is no dramatic rupture to trigger alarm. Instead, there is a steady lowering of expectation. When harm spreads slowly, adaptation keeps pace with it. Systems benefit from this dynamic. Abrupt oppression invites rebellion. Slow restriction invites accommodation. Policies framed as temporary often become permanent. Emergency measures normalize surveillance. Small corrupt practices normalize larger ones. Each step appears rational in isolation. Only in retrospect does the pattern become visible. Social reinforcement strengthens normalization. If others accept the change, individual resistance feels exaggerated. Humans look to their environment for cues. If colleagues comply, neighbors remain silent, and media treats new conditions as ordinary, then the change feels legitimate. Public calm signals safety, even if private discomfort persists. Silence amplifies acceptance. Gradual normalization is particularly effective when combined with distraction. Daily life continues. Work schedules remain intact. Entertainment persists. Families focus on personal concerns. When systemic shifts occur without interrupting routine, urgency fades. The mind prioritizes immediate responsibilities over abstract structural shifts. As long as life appears functional, harm blends into the background. There is also the psychological mechanism of justification. Once individuals adapt to a change, they often rationalize it to reduce cognitive discomfort. If I have accepted this new restriction, I may convince myself that it is necessary. If I tolerate corruption, I may conclude that corruption is unavoidable. Rationalization transforms passive acceptance into active defense. What began as reluctant compliance becomes normalized belief. Importantly, normalization does not mean approval. Many people sense decline. They notice inefficiency, inequality, or moral compromise. But because each step is small, the cost of resistance appears disproportionate. Why protest this minor change? Why risk conflict over this incremental shift? The calculation favors patience. And patience accumulates into permanence. Gradual normalization explains why harmful systems can endure for long periods without dramatic opposition. It is not that citizens do not care. It is that harm rarely crosses the threshold of immediate crisis. By the time it does, standards have shifted so far that recovery requires more than small adjustments. It requires structural transformation, and transformation feels risky. The most unsettling aspect of gradual normalization is that it feels reasonable at every stage. Each compromise seems pragmatic. Each adjustment appears temporary. Each delay feels responsible. But layered together, they reshape reality. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The unacceptable becomes standard. And once harm becomes ordinary, it no longer feels urgent. It feels like life. Human beings are not designed to stand alone. Long before laws, nations, or ideologies existed, survival depended on belonging to a group. Isolation in early human history meant vulnerability. To be separated from the tribe was to face danger without protection. That ancient wiring has never fully disappeared. Even in modern societies, social exclusion triggers anxiety, stress, and deep psychological discomfort. Fear of isolation is not weakness, it is biology. When individuals consider criticizing a harmful system, they rarely calculate only political consequences. They calculate social ones. Will I be alone? Will others agree? Will I be rejected? The fear of social exclusion often outweighs the desire for justice. People may privately disagree with authority or tradition, yet publicly conform because conformity preserves belonging. Belonging feels safe. Speaking out feels risky. One of the most powerful social dynamics behind silence is what psychologists call pluralistic ignorance. This occurs when individuals privately doubt a norm but assume others accept it. Each person believes they are alone in their skepticism. Because everyone remains silent, the illusion of consensus strengthens. The system appears universally supported, even when widespread private doubt exists. Silence feeds itself. The absence of visible dissent convinces others that dissent is rare. Social punishment does not need to be extreme to be effective. It can be subtle. Awkward conversations. Loss of trust. Being labeled difficult or disloyal. Humans are highly sensitive to these signals. We interpret even minor shifts in social approval as threats. The mind responds defensively. Better to stay quiet than to risk exclusion. Better to blend in than to be marked as different. Fear of isolation also shapes public identity. In environments where loyalty is equated with morality, dissent becomes stigmatized. Criticism is framed as betrayal. When group identity is strong, whether national, ideological, religious, or political, questioning the system can feel like rejecting the community itself. Few people willingly accept that role. The cost is emotional as much as social. Importantly, silence does not require agreement. Many silent individuals are internally conflicted. They feel tension between conscience and belonging. Yet the instinct to maintain connection often wins. Humans tolerate inner discomfort more easily than social exile. Internal doubt is private, public rejection is visible. Fear of isolation is amplified in hierarchical systems. When authority controls opportunity, status, or economic security, dissent risks more than reputation. It risks advancement. It risks access. It risks survival. Even in less overtly coercive environments, social networks influence employment, community support, and family stability. The calculation becomes pragmatic. Justice competes with relationship. Media environments can intensify this effect. When public narratives appear unified, dissent feels marginal. Individuals who disagree may underestimate how many others share their concerns. In contrast, when dissent becomes visible and collective, fear diminishes. People are more willing to speak when they perceive solidarity. Isolation weakens courage, community strengthens it. Fear of isolation explains why systems built on fragile consensus can appear stable for long periods. As long as enough individuals believe they are alone in their doubts, conformity continues. But the moment silence breaks, when one voice becomes 2, then 10, then thousands, perception shifts rapidly. What once felt isolating becomes shared. And shared doubt weakens the structure of imposed unity. The tragic paradox is that many systems persist not because the majority truly supports them, but because individuals fear standing alone. Silence preserves the illusion of agreement. The illusion of agreement preserves the system. At its core, fear of isolation reveals a fundamental human conflict, the need for belonging versus the need for truth. Belonging offers immediate security. Truth may require separation. And when the two collide, belonging often prevails. The illusion of later is one of the most powerful ways turning points disappear. Later feels harmless. It feels thoughtful, careful, responsible. It does not sound like refusal. It sounds like maturity. People tell themselves they are not rejecting action, only postponing it. They believe they are waiting for better conditions, more information, clearer signs. This belief soothes the mind. It removes urgency without creating guilt. Waiting feels wiser than acting, especially when action carries risk. But later is rarely a real moment in time. It is a psychological shelter. A way to avoid the cost of decision while preserving the image of good intention. Every system that benefits from passivity encourages this illusion. Not directly, not aggressively, but gently. There is always a reason why now is not the right time. The situation is too complex. The stakes are too high. People are not ready. Change must be gradual. Stability must be protected. Each reason sounds reasonable on its own. None of them sound immoral. Together, they create permanent delay. The mind accepts this because delay feels reversible. One can always act later. This belief is comforting. It creates the illusion of control without demanding courage. The danger of later is that it turns time into a substitute for responsibility. People begin to trust time itself to fix what action avoids. They believe problems will resolve naturally, that systems will self-correct, that progress is inevitable. History does not support this belief. Time does not correct injustice. It normalizes it. What persists without resistance becomes familiar. What becomes familiar stops feeling urgent. Delay allows harm to blend into everyday life. People adapt to conditions they once would have resisted. Each day without action lowers the threshold of what feels unacceptable. Later also protects identity. Acting early risks being wrong, overreacting, standing alone. Waiting allows a person to feel cautious rather than afraid. If things improve, waiting looks wise. If things worsen, responsibility can be shared. Everyone waited. No one feels uniquely accountable. This diffusion of responsibility is psychologically attractive. It reduces shame. It reduces exposure. But it also ensures that when action finally feels unavoidable, it is no longer easy. Early action is lonely but flexible. Late action is collective but desperate. Another reason later is so persuasive is that it rarely feels like surrender. It feels temporary. But temporary decisions repeated consistently become permanent outcomes. Each postponed response strengthens the structure that caused the problem. Power consolidates while people wait. Habits form. Rules solidify. Resistance becomes more costly. By the time people realize that later has arrived, the conditions that once made change possible are gone. What remains is reaction, not choice. The illusion of later also reshapes moral language. Urgency is reframed as recklessness. Patience is reframed as wisdom. Those who act early are labeled extreme, emotional, unrealistic. Those who wait are praised as balanced and responsible. Over time, people internalize this framing. They learn to distrust their own sense of urgency. They silence discomfort by calling it impatience. This is how conscience is trained to wait until it no longer matters. History shows a consistent pattern. The moment when action would have required the least sacrifice is always in the past. The moment when action becomes obvious is always costly. Later creates the gap between those two moments. It delays response until the price of delay exceeds the fear of action. And when people finally look back, they say the same thing every time. We thought there would be more time. There almost never is. Language that softens danger is one of the most effective tools for hiding historical turning points. It does not deny risk outright. It reframes it. It changes how danger feels rather than how it exists. When language is softened, threat loses its urgency. People are not told that something harmful is happening. They are told that something necessary is being managed. Words like security, stability, reform, adjustment, precaution, responsibility, and temporary measure carry emotional weight. They sound calm, rational, adult. They lower alarm without removing consequence. Danger rarely enters history using violent language. It enters through neutral terms. Through technical explanations. Through administrative vocabulary. Harm is described as policy. Loss is described as optimization. Control is described as protection. Restriction is described as balance. Each word removes friction from acceptance. People do not feel attacked. They feel informed. And informed people rarely resist. They trust systems that speak calmly. Calm language signals control. Control signals safety. This linguistic shift is powerful because it works on perception before reason. When something sounds reasonable, it feels reasonable. The brain relaxes. Emotional defenses drop. People stop asking what this change leads to and start asking whether it is efficiently implemented. Language redirects attention away from consequences and toward process. Once the focus is on how something is done instead of what it does, moral evaluation weakens. Softened language also fragments awareness. Instead of describing a transformation as a whole, it breaks it into parts. Each part sounds manageable. Each step appears minor. No single word carries enough weight to trigger resistance. Over time, people accept the sequence without ever confronting the direction. The destination is never named. Only the next step is discussed. And the next step always sounds reasonable. Another effect of softened language is moral displacement. Words that imply necessity remove personal responsibility. If something is necessary, opposing it feels childish or dangerous. People hesitate to challenge what is framed as unavoidable. Language closes debate before it begins. Those who question are accused not of being wrong, but of being unrealistic. Immature. Emotional. This discourages dissent without silencing it directly. Soft language also reshapes memory. When people look back, they struggle to identify when things changed. Because nothing ever sounded like a crisis. There was no moment of obvious danger. Only a series of calm explanations. By the time consequences become visible, the language that enabled them has already faded into the background. People remember outcomes, not vocabulary. But vocabulary shaped the outcome. History shows that the most dangerous changes are rarely described as dangerous. They are described as reasonable. That is why language matters more than intent. Intent can be hidden. Language cannot. It trains perception. It teaches people what to fear and what to tolerate. When danger is softened, resistance is delayed. And delay is often all a system needs. Language does not merely describe reality. It prepares people to accept it. The general philosophical conclusion is not comforting, but it is consistent. History shows that war is rarely the result of sudden madness or unavoidable destiny. It is the outcome of a long chain of human decisions shaped by fear, comfort, and delay. Violence does not erupt because people desire destruction. It erupts because people repeatedly choose what feels safer in the moment over what is necessary in the long term. War begins long before armies move. It begins when societies postpone truth, when leaders delay responsibility, when individuals silence discomfort and call it patience. Every unmade decision accumulates. Every avoided confrontation strengthens the conditions that make conflict inevitable. At its core, war is a philosophical failure before it is a military one. It reflects a refusal to accept uncertainty. Humans prefer clear rules, stable routines, and predictable structures. Freedom, by contrast, demands judgment without guarantees. It demands action without consensus. This makes freedom uncomfortable, while delay feels reasonable. As a result, societies drift. They wait for certainty before acting, even though certainty only appears after options have narrowed. By the time war feels unavoidable, the moment when it could have been prevented has already passed. The illusion that peace is preserved by waiting is one of history's most persistent errors. Time is not neutral. It does not pause threats. It amplifies them. Delayed decisions do not freeze reality. They allow power imbalances to grow, resentment to harden, and strategic advantage to shift. When action is postponed in the name of stability, instability quietly becomes structural. War then arrives not as a surprise, but as the final expression of a process that has been unfolding for years. Another central truth is that responsibility is always diffused before war and concentrated after it. Before conflict, no one feels fully accountable. Decisions are fragmented across institutions, procedures, committees, and justifications. Silence spreads responsibility thin until it feels weightless. After conflict begins, responsibility becomes obvious and heavy, but by then it is no longer useful. History does not punish hesitation at the moment it occurs. It punishes it later, through consequences that can no longer be debated. War also reveals the moral cost of prioritizing order over justice. Order feels protective. It promises safety and continuity. Justice, however, demands disruption. It challenges existing arrangements and exposes uncomfortable truths. When societies consistently choose order, injustice becomes manageable, normalized, and eventually invisible. War is often the point at which accumulated injustice breaks the illusion of stability. It is not the collapse of order, but the proof that order was hollow. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is that war does not require evil people. It requires ordinary people making understandable choices under pressure. People who adapt. People who wait. People who hope someone else will act first. People who believe history is made elsewhere. These choices do not feel dramatic. They feel practical. Responsible. Mature. But history is not moved by intentions. It is moved by outcomes. And the outcome of repeated delay is force. The final philosophical lesson is this. Violence is not humanity's first language. It is its last. It appears when thought is postponed too long, when truth is negotiated away, and when responsibility is deferred until it hardens into necessity. War is not proof that humans are incapable of reason. It is proof that reason, when delayed, loses its power. History does not demand perfection. It demands timing. When societies fail to act while action is still possible, history does not forgive. It compensates. And it compensates with blood. The silence of the majority is one of the most reliable indicators that a turning point is being missed. It is rarely aggressive, rarely dramatic. It is quiet, calm, and reassuring. When most people remain silent, that silence is interpreted as evidence that nothing is seriously wrong. Humans are social learners. We look to others to understand reality. When the crowd appears calm, calmness becomes proof of safety. Silence becomes consensus. And consensus feels like truth, even when it is only absence of resistance. Majorities do not move by insight. They move by alignment. An individual may sense danger early, may feel unease, may notice patterns that do not sit right. But when that discomfort is not reflected back by others, it feels unreliable. People begin to doubt their own perception. They ask themselves whether they are overreacting, misunderstanding, exaggerating. Silence from others does not just fail to warn. It actively discourages awareness. It tells the individual that concern is unnecessary, even embarrassing. Over time, people learn that speaking early carries social risk, while remaining quiet carries social protection. The majority rarely believes it is choosing silence. It believes it is being reasonable. Most people wait not because they agree, but because they are watching. Waiting for someone else to speak first. Waiting for authority to acknowledge the problem. Waiting for numbers. This creates a paradox. Everyone is waiting for confirmation that can only exist if someone breaks the silence. But breaking silence is costly. It attracts attention. It creates friction. It risks isolation. And isolation feels more threatening than gradual harm. So silence persists, not because people are unaware, but because awareness without support feels unsafe. Silence also spreads responsibility thin. When many people are present but inactive, no one feels uniquely accountable. Each person assumes that if the situation were truly serious, someone else would act. This assumption is comforting. It allows people to believe that inaction is neutral rather than complicit. But history is shaped less by those who initiate harm and more by those who allow it to continue. Silence does not stop events. It stabilizes them. It allows processes to mature without resistance. Another reason majority silence is so powerful is that it creates false legitimacy. If most people are quiet, the system appears accepted. Acceptance creates confidence. Confidence accelerates consolidation of power. Decisions become easier to justify. Resistance becomes easier to dismiss. Those who finally speak are no longer seen as early warnings. They are seen as disruptions, as troublemakers, as threats to stability. By the time the majority reacts, reaction is no longer prevention. It is damage control. Silence of the majority also reshapes memory. Later, when consequences are visible, people struggle to understand how so many could have remained quiet. But at the time, silence did not feel like a choice. It felt like normality. It felt like waiting. It felt like safety. That is the danger. Silence does not announce itself as surrender. It disguises itself as patience. And while the majority waits, history moves forward without them. Human adaptation to decline is one of the quietest ways history changes direction. It does not arrive as surrender. It arrives as adjustment. People rarely accept deterioration all at once. They accept it in fragments. A small loss here. A minor restriction there. An inconvenience explained as temporary. Each step feels survivable. And because it is survivable, it is tolerated. The human mind is remarkably flexible when it comes to discomfort. It recalibrates expectations faster than it resists conditions. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes normal, not because it is justified, but because it is familiar. Adaptation begins as a coping mechanism. When circumstances worsen, adapting feels like strength. It allows life to continue. It reduces stress. It preserves routine. But over time, adaptation stops being a response and becomes a habit. People no longer remember what conditions felt like before the decline. They measure reality against yesterday, not against what was once possible. Standards lower quietly. The baseline shifts. Decline becomes invisible because comparison disappears. When nothing is compared to a better past, deterioration feels like reality itself. This process is dangerous because it removes urgency. As long as people can adapt, they do not feel compelled to resist. Survival replaces principle. Endurance replaces opposition. Individuals begin to take pride in their ability to cope. Coping becomes identity. At least we manage. At least we get by. These phrases sound resilient, but they often mark the moment when resistance has ended. Systems do not need to crush people who adapt willingly. Adaptation stabilizes control more effectively than force ever could. Adaptation also reshapes memory. People forget what they once objected to. Yesterday's outrage becomes today's background noise. What once sparked debate now feels tedious to revisit. Constant exposure dulls emotional response. The mind conserves energy by accepting what it cannot easily change. This conservation feels rational. But rationalization slowly replaces judgment. People stop asking whether something should exist and start asking how to live with it. Another aspect of adaptation is social synchronization. Individuals adapt faster when others adapt too. Seeing everyone else adjust creates the impression that adjustment is the correct response. Resistance begins to look impractical, even selfish. Why disrupt life when everyone else is coping? This collective adaptation reinforces itself. Each person's silence confirms another's decision to endure. Over time, the cost of resisting feels higher than the cost of accepting decline. Adaptation also delays recognition. People often realize what has been lost only when it is gone completely. Partial loss feels manageable. Total loss feels shocking. But total loss is simply the accumulation of many partial losses that were adapted to along the way. History rarely records the moment adaptation began. It records the moment when adaptation was no longer enough. The most tragic aspect of human adaptation to decline is that it is not rooted in ignorance. It is rooted in intelligence used for survival rather than preservation. People know conditions are worsening. They simply learn to live within them. And by the time living within them becomes unbearable, the ability to change them has weakened. Adaptation keeps people alive, but it often allows decline to finish its work uninterrupted. Recognition almost always comes too late, not because the truth was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. Awareness does not suddenly appear at the end of a process. It exists throughout it, faintly at first, then more clearly, then unavoidably. What changes is not the availability of information, but the willingness to accept its implications. Early recognition demands action without certainty. Late recognition arrives with certainty but without options. Humans prefer certainty, even when it is useless. This preference shapes the timing of awareness. People sense that something is wrong long before they admit it openly. They feel discomfort, unease, quiet doubt. But doubt without confirmation feels irresponsible. Acting on it feels premature. So recognition is postponed until consequences remove all ambiguity. By then, recognition no longer serves prevention. It serves explanation. Late recognition feels different from early awareness. It feels obvious, clear, undeniable. People look back and wonder how they missed what now seems so visible. They assume the signs were subtle or hidden. Often, they were not. They were simply normalized. Each warning was absorbed into routine. Each concern was softened by repetition. Each exception became precedent. Recognition was delayed not by ignorance, but by gradual accommodation. The mind adapts to avoid constant alarm. It learns to live with contradiction. It learns to quiet signals that demand costly action. Over time, what once felt alarming becomes background noise. Another reason recognition comes late is that acknowledging a turning point early creates social risk. Early recognition isolates. It separates the individual from the collective rhythm. It invites disagreement, ridicule, exclusion. Most people wait until recognition is shared. Shared recognition feels safe. It spreads responsibility. But shared recognition requires numbers, and numbers arrive only after consequences affect many. By the time recognition becomes collective, the conditions that allowed early intervention have disappeared. What remains is reaction, not choice. Late recognition is also encouraged by narratives of inevitability. Once outcomes unfold, people reconstruct the past as unavoidable. They say it was bound to happen, that forces were too large, that no one could have stopped it. These narratives reduce guilt. They make late recognition feel tragic rather than negligent. But inevitability is usually created by delay. What feels inevitable at the end was flexible at the beginning. Recognition came too late because it was safer to believe in inevitability than to confront responsibility while change was still possible. Recognition also comes late because people confuse awareness with action. They believe that noticing a problem internally is enough. That concern itself is a form of resistance. But unexpressed recognition does not interrupt processes. It coexists with them. Systems do not respond to private awareness. They respond to friction. Without friction, recognition remains inert. It comforts the individual without challenging the structure. This allows people to feel morally awake while remaining practically inactive. When consequences finally force action, people mistake this forced response for awakening, forgetting that awareness existed long before. History consistently records moments of regret rather than moments of hesitation. It documents what people said afterward, not what they felt before. Late recognition produces a specific language. We did not know. No one warned us. It happened so fast. These phrases appear again and again, across cultures and eras. They are not lies. They are reconstructions. They describe how recognition felt at the end, not how awareness existed at the beginning. Early signals rarely feel like knowledge. They feel like discomfort. and discomfort is easy to dismiss. Recognition comes too late because humans are trained to wait for permission to act. Permission from authority, from consensus, from certainty. But permission arrives only after power has settled. After habits have formed. After costs have increased. Early recognition requires acting without permission. That is why it is rare. It demands solitude, responsibility, and the willingness to be wrong alone. Late recognition demands none of these. It demands only acceptance of what has already happened. In the end, recognition does not fail because people are blind. It fails because they are cautious. It arrives when caution no longer protects anything. When recognition finally feels undeniable, it is no longer dangerous to recognize. It is only painful. And pain, unlike responsibility, can be shared without changing the past. Law as a moral anesthetic works quietly, precisely because it feels orderly and reassuring. Law presents itself as neutral, rational, and objective. It speaks in procedures, clauses, and formal language that removes emotion from judgment. This emotional distance is not a flaw. It is the function. When something is legal, people instinctively relax their moral vigilance. Legality creates the sense that responsibility has been transferred upward, away from the individual and into the system. Actions stop feeling like choices and start feeling like obligations. The anesthetic effect begins the moment legality replaces conscience as the primary measure of right and wrong. People stop asking whether an action is just and begin asking whether it is permitted. This shift is subtle but decisive. Conscience is unstable. It is personal, contextual, and uncomfortable. Law is stable. It offers clear boundaries and predictable outcomes. Predictability calms anxiety. And calm makes compliance easier. When the law speaks, doubt quiets down. People trust that if something were truly wrong, it would not be allowed. Law also fragments moral responsibility. Large systems divide actions into roles and procedures. Each individual performs a small, defined task. No one sees the full outcome. No one feels fully responsible. Harm moves through the system step by step, sanitized by process. Each participant can point to the rule that required their action. This diffusion of responsibility is deeply comforting. It allows people to participate in harmful outcomes without experiencing themselves as harmful. They were just doing their job. Following protocol. Respecting the law. Another anesthetic quality of law is its language. Legal language is technical, abstract, and impersonal. It describes people as cases, situations as matters, suffering as impact. This abstraction dulls empathy. It creates distance between decision and consequence. The farther the language moves from human experience, the easier it becomes to accept outcomes that would feel intolerable if described plainly. Law does not deny harm. It reframes it. Law also creates the illusion of inevitability. Once something is codified, it feels fixed, established, unquestionable. Challenging it appears unrealistic or dangerous. People assume that changing the law is slow, complex, and risky, so they adjust themselves instead. This adjustment feels mature. Responsible. The law teaches patience. It tells people to wait for reform, to trust the process, to follow proper channels. While people wait, power stabilizes. Structures harden. What began as temporary becomes permanent. Historically, many of the most destructive systems operated entirely within legal frameworks. Not in spite of the law, but through it. Law did not fail in these moments. It succeeded at what it was designed to do: preserve order, protect structure, and reduce uncertainty. Justice was secondary. Law does not naturally seek what is right. It seeks what is consistent. Consistency benefits those who already hold power. The most dangerous aspect of law as a moral anesthetic is that it allows people to feel virtuous while doing harm. Obedience becomes morality. Compliance becomes character. Resistance is reframed as irresponsibility. People learn to equate being lawful with being good. Once this equation is internalized, conscience weakens. Discomfort is dismissed as personal feeling rather than moral signal. Law does not remove morality. It numbs it. It quiets the inner voice by offering external certainty. And when people later ask how injustice was allowed to persist for so long, the answer is rarely that the law was broken. The answer is that the law was followed. The myth that history is made elsewhere is one of the most comforting illusions people hold. It suggests that history is shaped by distant figures, powerful leaders, grand institutions, and dramatic events far removed from ordinary life. In this view, history happens on stages we do not stand on, through decisions we do not make, at levels we cannot reach. Ordinary people become spectators. Their role is to endure, adapt, and survive while history unfolds above them. This belief feels harmless, even humble, but it is deeply dangerous. It removes responsibility from the present and relocates it to an abstract elsewhere. When people believe history is made elsewhere, their own choices feel insignificant. Speaking up feels symbolic at best, pointless at worst. Silence becomes rational. Waiting becomes sensible. People tell themselves that real change comes from elections, leaders, revolutions, or systems far beyond their influence. This belief allows them to disengage without guilt. If history is made by others, then inaction is not complicity, it is realism. But history does not move only through decisive moments at the top. It moves through accumulation at the bottom. Through millions of small decisions made daily by people who believe their choices do not matter. This myth survives because large events are easier to remember than small behaviors. History books record laws, wars, speeches, and collapses. They rarely record the quiet adjustments that made those events possible. They do not record how many people stayed silent, how many adapted, how many chose comfort over friction. Yet those choices form the foundation upon which large events rest. Leaders do not act in a vacuum. Institutions do not operate without participation. Systems do not function without consent, habit, and compliance. History is not imposed from above. It is stabilized from below. The belief that history is made elsewhere also protects identity. If responsibility belongs to distant actors, individuals can preserve a self-image of moral neutrality. They can believe they are good people trapped in bad systems, rather than participants in systems sustained by behavior. This belief reduces discomfort. It allows people to criticize outcomes without examining their own role in enabling them. But history is not shaped only by those who initiate harm. It is shaped by those who make harm sustainable. By those who normalize it. By those who allow it to persist unchallenged. Another reason this myth is powerful is that participation in history rarely feels dramatic. It feels ordinary. It feels like going along, keeping quiet, adjusting expectations, choosing not to escalate, deciding that now is not the time. These choices do not feel historic. They feel practical, responsible, mature. But history does not require drama to turn. It requires direction. And direction is set long before consequences become visible. When people finally recognize that a turning point has passed, they often say they never had a chance to influence it. That decisions were already made. That power was too concentrated. That nothing they could have done would have mattered. Sometimes this is true in the late stages. But it is rarely true in the early ones. Early on, history is still flexible. Still negotiable. Still shaped by participation. It is only after countless small decisions align in the same direction that change becomes irreversible. The myth that history is made elsewhere persists because it is comforting. It allows people to feel innocent in outcomes they quietly enabled. But history does not ask who intended what. It records what was allowed, what was normalized, what was tolerated. History is not made elsewhere. It is made in ordinary moments, by ordinary people, who believe they are not making it at all. The illusion of later is one of the most decisive forces in the philosophy of war, because wars are rarely caused by sudden aggression alone. They are caused by postponed decisions. In military history, the most catastrophic battles are often preceded not by ignorance, but by delay. Leaders see the threat. Societies sense the danger. Warnings exist. But action is deferred in the belief that there will be more time, a better moment, a clearer justification. Later becomes a strategy for avoiding the cost of early resistance. It sounds rational. It sounds cautious. It sounds diplomatic. In reality, it shifts initiative to the opponent. In warfare, time is never neutral. Every moment of delay strengthens one side and weakens the other. Yet the illusion of later convinces people that time is a buffer rather than a weapon. States postpone confrontation to preserve stability, believing that avoiding conflict now will prevent a larger one later. Philosophically, this reflects a deep human bias, the preference for short-term comfort over long-term clarity. War exposes this bias brutally. By the time later arrives, the choice is no longer whether to fight, but how badly to lose. The illusion also operates psychologically before any army moves. Societies tell themselves that escalation is unnecessary, that tensions will cool, that rational actors will step back. These beliefs are comforting, because they preserve the moral image of peace while allowing preparation to remain minimal. In this way, later becomes moral anesthesia. It allows people to feel responsible while remaining inactive. But war does not wait for moral readiness. It rewards initiative, not intention. In many historical conflicts, decisive battles were lost long before they were fought, because opportunities for deterrence were delayed. Early action would have been controversial, unpopular, politically costly. Later action became unavoidable, but vastly more destructive. Philosophy reveals the core contradiction here. Humans demand certainty before acting, but war punishes those who wait for certainty. Strategic advantage belongs to those who act under uncertainty, not those who wait for proof. The illusion of later also shapes how wars are justified. When action is postponed, narratives are constructed to defend delay. Leaders speak of diplomacy, patience, balance, and restraint. These words reduce public anxiety and discourage resistance to inaction. But restraint without preparedness is not restraint. It is exposure. When war finally arrives, it is framed as sudden and unavoidable, masking the long period in which choices were repeatedly deferred. On a deeper level, later reflects a philosophical refusal to accept tragedy as part of reality. People hope history can be negotiated gently, that conflict can be avoided indefinitely through reason alone. This hope is not irrational, but it becomes dangerous when it replaces strategy. War does not emerge because people want it. It emerges because they misjudge time. They believe delay preserves peace, when it often erodes the conditions that make peace possible. In the end, the illusion of later collapses at the battlefield. There, time reveals its true nature. Not as a healer, but as an amplifier. Every delayed decision returns with interest. Every avoided choice reappears as necessity. And when people look back after the battle, they often say the same thing: if we had acted earlier. Philosophy answers with a harder truth. Acting earlier was always possible. It was simply uncomfortable. The silence of the majority is not the absence of opinion. It is the presence of fear disguised as normality. Most people do not remain silent because they are unaware. They remain silent because awareness without support feels dangerous. Humans are social creatures. We calibrate reality by observing others. When the majority appears calm, calmness is interpreted as safety. Silence becomes evidence. If no one is reacting, then reacting feels unnecessary. If no one is speaking, then speaking feels reckless. This is how silence turns into a signal rather than a void. Majorities do not move through insight. They move through permission. Individuals sense discomfort early, but discomfort alone is fragile. It needs reflection. When it is not mirrored by others, it feels unreliable. People begin to doubt their own perception. They ask whether they are exaggerating, misunderstanding, or overthinking. Silence from others does not merely fail to warn. It actively suppresses doubt. It teaches the individual that concern is socially unsafe. Over time, people learn that remaining quiet preserves belonging, while speaking risks isolation. And belonging is often valued more than truth. The silence of the majority is reinforced by waiting. Most people believe they are not choosing silence, only postponing speech. They wait for someone more qualified, more powerful, more confident to speak first. They wait for authority, for numbers, for consensus. But consensus can only emerge if someone breaks silence. This creates a paralysis loop. Everyone waits for confirmation that can only exist if someone acts without it. Silence sustains itself because breaking it carries a cost that most are unwilling to pay alone. Silence also diffuses responsibility. When many people are present and inactive, no one feels uniquely accountable. Each person assumes that if the situation were truly serious, someone else would intervene. This assumption is comforting. It transforms inaction into neutrality. People tell themselves they are not responsible for outcomes they did not initiate. But history is shaped less by those who initiate harm and more by those who allow it to continue. Silence does not cause events directly. It stabilizes them. It allows processes to mature without friction. Another danger of majority silence is that it creates false legitimacy. When few people object, systems interpret quiet as acceptance. Decisions become easier to justify. Power consolidates more quickly. Dissent becomes easier to dismiss. Those who eventually speak are no longer heard as early warnings. They are treated as disruptions. As threats to stability. As people who arrived too late. By the time the majority finds its voice, the moment for prevention has already passed. What remains is reaction. Silence of the majority also reshapes memory. Later generations struggle to understand how so many people remained quiet. But at the time, silence did not feel like surrender. It felt like caution. It felt like waiting. It felt like responsibility. This is the most dangerous quality of silence. It rarely feels wrong while it is happening. It feels reasonable. And while the majority waits, history does not pause. It moves forward, shaped by the absence of resistance. Fear has always been one of the most efficient tools of power because it produces immediate order. When fear enters a system, questions disappear, hesitation collapses, choice narrows into obedience. The human brain under threat prioritizes safety over truth and submission over evaluation. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological response. Fear activates survival circuitry. It shuts down complex reasoning and redirects energy toward compliance. That redirection is what makes fear feel like control. In political and social systems, this mechanism is extraordinarily effective. When punishment is visible and unpredictable, people adjust behavior rapidly. They do not wait to understand, they act to avoid harm. This creates the appearance of stability. Crime drops, dissent quiets, resistance retreats underground. From the outside, the system looks orderly. From the inside, it feels tense but manageable. And that manageability is mistaken for strength. Power that instills fear appears efficient because it compresses time. It achieves results without negotiation, without explanation. and without consent, the speed of compliance convinces observers that control is absolute. Fear simplifies the world. It reduces moral complexity into binary choices: obey or suffer, belong or be excluded, stay silent or be punished. This reduction is psychologically comforting in uncertain environments. Uncertainty is mentally exhausting. Fear replaces uncertainty with clarity. The rules may be brutal, but they are clear, and clarity lowers anxiety. This is why populations under threat often accept harsh authority. The authority provides predictable danger instead of unpredictable chaos. People choose known fear over unknown risk. This dynamic explains why cruelty is often interpreted as decisiveness. Harsh action demonstrates willingness to inflict cost. Willingness to inflict cost signals dominance. Dominance signals control. Control signals safety, even when that safety is illusory. The system does not need to be just. It only needs to appear capable of enforcing consequences. Once fear is established, control becomes self-sustaining. People internalize limits. They censor themselves. They anticipate punishment before it occurs. This anticipation is more powerful than punishment itself. The empire no longer needs to act constantly. Fear does the work in advance. Historically, this mechanism appears repeatedly. Empires maintain order not through constant violence, but through remembered violence: public executions, exile, confiscation, imprisonment. These acts are not about the individual punished, they are messages to everyone else. The message is simple: this can happen to you. Once that message is absorbed, obedience becomes rational. Fear transforms compliance into self-protection. However, this form of control is fragile. It depends on sustained intimidation. Fear must be renewed or remembered. It cannot generate genuine loyalty, only avoidance. People obey not because they believe, but because they calculate. This calculation erodes trust and creativity. In fear-based systems, initiative disappears, innovation stalls. People do not ask what is possible, they ask what is permitted. The system becomes rigid, because flexibility requires safety. Fear also distorts perception at the top. Leaders surrounded by obedience mistake silence for agreement. They assume compliance equals support. But fear suppresses feedback. Problems go unreported until they are unmanageable. Bad news travels slowly or not at all. The system feels controlled while reality destabilizes underneath. This is the central illusion. Fear creates short-term order at the cost of long-term awareness. Another paradox emerges: fear centralizes power, but it also isolates it. The more a system relies on fear, the less it understands the people it governs. Citizens become objects of management rather than partners in stability. The state watches behavior instead of listening to voices. Control increases while legitimacy declines. The empire grows stronger in appearance and weaker in substance. Fear-based control also escalates over time. What once frightened no longer does. The system must intensify measures to maintain the same effect. Punishments grow harsher, surveillance grows broader, language grows more threatening. This escalation signals insecurity, but it is often interpreted as strength. Observers confuse intensity with authority. They mistake repression for resolve. Mercy interrupts this cycle. Mercy reduces fear. Fear reduction weakens control. Visibility of mercy creates uncertainty about consequences, and uncertainty threatens dominance. This is why mercy is seen as dangerous in fear-based systems. It loosens the grip. It introduces unpredictability not from violence, but from choice. And choice undermines control. In truth, fear does not equal strength. It equals leverage. Leverage requires constant pressure. Strength, by contrast, can release pressure without collapse. Empires that rely on fear confuse leverage with resilience. They maintain order by tightening grip rather than strengthening foundation. This works until the grip exhausts itself or breaks entirely. Fear equals control only in the narrowest sense. It controls behavior, but not belief. It commands obedience, but not commitment. It silences, but it does not convince, and systems that depend on silence eventually lose the ability to correct themselves. When fear becomes the primary mechanism of order, collapse does not come from rebellion alone. It comes from internal decay, from the inability to adapt once fear stops working. The tragedy is that fear feels powerful precisely when it is most corrosive. It creates an illusion of mastery while hollowing the structure it sustains. Empires that mistake fear for strength do not fall because fear disappears, they fall because fear succeeds too well, until nothing else remains. Across history, the association between cruelty and strength did not emerge randomly. It was refined, systematized, and perfected by empires that understood one brutal truth: fear communicates faster than trust. Rome, the Mongol Empire, and modern totalitarian regimes each mastered this language in different eras, using cruelty not as chaos, but as strategy. In all three cases, violence was not merely punishment. It was messaging. Rome understood cruelty as governance. The Roman state did not rely on constant terror, but on carefully staged brutality. Public executions, crucifixions, and gladiatorial games were not spontaneous acts of violence, they were deliberate spectacles designed to teach lessons. The crucifixion of rebels along roads was not meant to kill efficiently. It was meant to be seen. The message was unmistakable: this is the cost of defiance. Fear reduced uncertainty. People did not need to guess what would happen if they resisted, they already knew. This clarity created compliance. Rome could rule vast territories not because it was omnipresent, but because its reputation was. Cruelty traveled faster than legions, and because punishment was public, obedience became internalized. People governed themselves to avoid becoming examples, but this same mechanism blinded Rome over time. The more it relied on intimidation, the less it understood loyalty. Silence replaced feedback. The empire mistook fear-induced order for legitimacy. And when fear weakened, there was nothing underneath it to hold the structure together. The Mongol Empire elevated cruelty into psychological warfare. Unlike Rome, which used ritualized punishment to stabilize internal order, the Mongols used extreme violence to eliminate resistance before it formed. They destroyed entire cities not because it was always necessary, but because it was efficient. A single massacre could spare dozens of future battles. Once the reputation was established, many cities surrendered without a fight. This was terror as optimization. The Mongols understood that cruelty, when concentrated and unpredictable, could paralyze opposition. The fear they generated preceded them. Cities did not calculate military odds, they calculated survival. The paradox is that Mongol cruelty was often selective. Once submission occurred, order could be relatively tolerant, but mercy came only after terror did its work. This reinforced the lesson. Mercy is not a right, it is a reward, and rewards controlled by power increase obedience more than violence alone. However, this system depended entirely on maintaining the aura of unstoppable force. The moment that aura fractured, the empire fragmented rapidly. Fear unified quickly, but it did not bind deeply. Modern totalitarian regimes refined cruelty even further. They internalized fear. The goal was no longer only public punishment, but psychological occupation. These systems learned that constant visible violence was inefficient. Instead, they cultivated uncertainty. Arbitrary arrests, unpredictable enforcement, and shifting rules created an environment where people could never feel safe. Every citizen became a potential suspect. Every thought carried risk. This form of cruelty did not rely on spectacle alone. It relied on anticipation. People disciplined themselves more effectively than any police force could. Fear became internal governance. Totalitarian power did not need to be everywhere, it needed to be possible everywhere. This omnipresent threat collapsed individuality and erased trust. People learned not only to obey, but to think cautiously, to speak carefully, to doubt even their own perceptions. The regime appeared strong because resistance vanished, but what disappeared was not dissent, it was visibility. In all three cases, cruelty functioned as a shortcut to order. It bypassed persuasion, consensus, and legitimacy. It created immediate compliance and simplified control, but the cost was always the same. Cruelty destroyed feedback. When people are afraid, they do not tell the truth, they tell what keeps them safe. This creates a fatal asymmetry. Power believes it is informed because reports continue to arrive, but those reports are curated by fear. The system loses its ability to perceive reality accurately. And a system that cannot see cannot adapt. Rome did not fall when it lost battles. It fell when it lost legitimacy and awareness. The Mongol Empire did not collapse because of rebellion alone. It collapsed because its cohesion depended on perpetual dominance. Totalitarian regimes do not end because fear disappears, they end because fear hollows out society until nothing remains capable of sustaining power once control weakens. These examples reveal the same illusion. Cruelty looks like strength because it works fast. It commands bodies. It stills crowds. It produces visible order. But strength measured by silence is deceptive. Silence can mean consent. or terror, empires that confuse the two mistake suppression for stability. History does not deny that cruelty can build empires. It shows that cruelty cannot sustain them indefinitely. It creates obedience without trust, order without legitimacy, and control without resilience. When fear finally stops working, whether through exhaustion, exposure, or change, the collapse feels sudden, but it is not sudden at all. It is the delayed consequence of a system that chose domination over durability. Cruelty speaks loudly, mercy speaks slowly. History remembers the loud voices first, but it is the slow forces that determine what survives. Long before empires, long before laws, long before philosophy, human behavior was shaped by survival. In small tribes exposed to predators, scarcity, and rival groups, the cost of hesitation could mean extinction. In such environments, aggression was not cruelty. It was protection, decisiveness was not tyranny. It was defense. The individuals who reacted quickly to threat, who punished betrayal harshly, and who projected dominance often increased the group's immediate chances of survival. Over generations, this survival logic left psychological residue. What once helped small bands endure dangerous landscapes gradually became embedded in collective instincts. This is the shadow of natural selection. It does not disappear when societies become more complex. It adapts. In early human communities, mercy carried risk. Sharing limited resources with outsiders could weaken the tribe, sparing an enemy could invite retaliation, tolerating dissent during crisis could fracture cohesion. Harsh punishment, by contrast, created clear boundaries. Clear boundaries reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is metabolically expensive for the brain. It demands analysis, deliberation, and trust, but in high-risk environments, trust could be exploited. Aggression simplified decision-making. It eliminated ambiguity. The group survived not because it was compassionate, but because it was cohesive, and cohesion was often enforced through dominance. Over thousands of years, this logic shaped leadership expectations. A leader who appeared strong, physically assertive, uncompromising, capable of swift punishment, signaled protection to the group. Protection reduced anxiety increased cooperation. This does not mean cruelty was morally justified. It means cruelty was psychologically legible. It sent a signal the brain could decode instantly. Power is present, threat is controlled. Mercy did not produce the same signal. Mercy required interpretation. It required assessing intentions, probabilities, and future outcomes. That cognitive load made it slower and more fragile in perception. As societies expanded beyond tribal structures, the conditions changed, but the instincts remained. Cities replaced camps, empires replaced clans, laws replaced brute retaliation, yet the ancient wiring persisted. When collective fear rises, during war, economic collapse, or cultural uncertainty, societies regress toward survival logic. They seek visible dominance, they seek decisive action, they gravitate toward leaders who project certainty rather than nuance. This is not because people consciously reject compassion. It is because under stress, the brain defaults to what once ensured survival. Natural selection rewarded rapid response to threat, not moral reflection. It prioritized safety over fairness and cohesion over complexity. The modern world, however, requires something different. It demands negotiation, delayed gratification, and cooperation across differences. These traits evolve later and more slowly. They are fragile compared to primal instincts. A single shock can awaken the older circuitry. The language of protection and punishment becomes louder. The appetite for strong displays of force returns. This is why cruelty often resurfaces in times of instability. It resonates with ancestral memory. But the shadow of natural selection is incomplete if misunderstood. Aggression ensured survival in small, short-term contexts. It did not ensure flourishing in large, interdependent systems. As human networks grew, cooperation and trust became more advantageous than dominance alone. Tribes that could trade, coordinate, and build alliances outlasted those that relied solely on fear. The problem is timing. Aggression produces immediate compliance. Cooperation produces delayed resilience. Our perception mistakes immediacy for strength and delay for weakness. This misreading persists because our evolutionary psychology privileges short-term survival cues over long-term stability indicators. In this shadow, we see the root of the paradox. cruelty appears powerful because it activates ancient survival signals, mercy appears risky because it suppresses them. To show mercy is to override instinct. It requires confidence that the environment can tolerate vulnerability. It requires belief that trust will not be exploited. This belief is cognitively demanding and emotionally exposed. Aggression demands less reflection. It feels simpler, clearer, and therefore stronger. Understanding this evolutionary backdrop does not justify cruelty. It explains why it feels persuasive. It reveals why societies repeatedly gravitate toward harshness under pressure and why compassion is often misread as naivety. The shadow of natural selection still influences modern judgment. It shapes how authority is perceived and how strength is interpreted, but evolution is not destiny. The same species that evolved aggression also evolved empathy, cooperation, and moral reasoning. The tension between cruelty and mercy is not a battle between weakness and strength. It is a conflict between two evolutionary strategies, one optimized for immediate threat, another for long-term coexistence. Empires that operate solely within the older strategy may dominate quickly, but they struggle to sustain legitimacy. Empires that learn to integrate restraint with authority move beyond survival into stability. The shadow remains, but awareness changes how it governs us. The real question is not whether cruelty once aided survival. It is whether we continue to mistake ancestral reflexes for modern wisdom.
The trial. Putting a question on trial. Giordano Bruno was not brought before the Inquisition to debate ideas. The purpose of his trial was never to discover truth. It was to measure obedience. Courts that judge thinkers do not ask whether an idea is correct. They ask whether it can be controlled. From the moment Bruno was arrested, the outcome was already shaped. He was not treated as a man who might be mistaken, but as a man who refused limits. His imprisonment lasted years, not because the case was complex, but because the system hoped exhaustion would succeed where argument failed. The trial was slow, repetitive, and psychological. Bruno was confronted with lists of propositions extracted from his writings, not to understand them, but to isolate and simplify them until they could be declared heretical. Context was removed. Nuance was erased. Ideas were reduced to slogans that could be condemned. This is how power judges thought. It does not engage complexity, it flattens it. Throughout the proceedings, the goal was not evidence but recantation. Again and again, Bruno was offered a way out. He could live if he would deny his ideas publicly. Silence would have been enough. Partial retreat would have been enough. But submission had to be visible. The institution did not need him to believe differently. It needed him to say so. Truth was irrelevant. Performance was everything. To recant would have meant more than correcting a mistake. It would have meant accepting that authority, not conscience, defined reality. Bruno understood this clearly. He did not argue loudly in court. He did not shout or provoke. He simply refused to surrender the independence of his mind. That refusal transformed the trial into something symbolic. The courtroom became a stage where power attempted to reassert its dominance over thought itself. What made the trial unbearable for the authorities was Bruno's consistency. Years passed, but his position did not collapse. He did not grow confused. He did not beg. He did not trade clarity for safety. This revealed the weakness of the system. A structure built on fear depends on eventual compliance. When compliance does not arrive, fear loses its effectiveness. At that point, punishment becomes necessary, not to correct the accused, but to reassure the obedient. Bruno's final sentence was not the conclusion of a legal process. It was a message. The message was simple. Questions that cannot be silenced by persuasion will be silenced by force. The trial did not end when the verdict was read. It ended when Bruno's body was destroyed in public, because the true audience of the trial was never Bruno. It was everyone else watching. What does it mean to be burned alive? Giordano Bruno was not executed simply to be killed. Burning at the stake was never chosen because it was efficient. It was chosen because it was visible, slow, and unforgettable. To burn a person alive is not only to end a life, but to communicate a message. It turns punishment into a spectacle and death into a warning. Fire does not erase quietly. It announces itself. It demands witnesses. It imprints fear into memory. When authorities choose fire, they are not addressing the condemned alone. They are speaking to the crowd, to future thinkers, to anyone who might consider following the same path. Burning alive is a punishment designed to collapse meaning. It strips the condemned of dignity in public, reducing a thinking human being to a body in pain. This transformation is intentional. It tells observers that ideas, no matter how complex or profound, will ultimately be reduced to flesh if they challenge power. The fire declares that thought has limits, and those limits are enforced by pain. In this sense, burning is not a reaction to danger. It is a performance of control. It shows that authority reaches beyond law and into the body itself. For Bruno, fire was chosen because silence had failed. Years of imprisonment, interrogation, and psychological pressure had not broken him. He had not retracted his ideas. He had not confessed error. The system had exhausted its softer tools. Fire was the final instrument, not to persuade him, but to erase the example he represented. A man who remains unbroken threatens the illusion that obedience is inevitable. Burning him was meant to restore that illusion. There is also a symbolic cruelty in fire. Fire consumes without discrimination. It does not argue, it does not judge, it simply destroys. By choosing fire, authority denies the humanity of the condemned. The person becomes an object, a problem to be eliminated. This mirrors how systems treat dangerous questions. They do not engage them deeply. They destroy them entirely. Public execution by burning also transfers responsibility away from individuals. No single person feels accountable. The crowd watches. Officials follow procedure. The executioner performs a task. Everyone participates, and therefore no one feels guilty. This diffusion of responsibility is essential. It allows cruelty to appear normal. It allows violence to feel justified. The ritual turns murder into duty, yet fire carries a paradox. While it is meant to erase, it often preserves. Flames draw attention. They fix memory. A quiet execution would have passed unnoticed. Fire ensures remembrance. Bruno's body was destroyed, but the image of his refusal survived. The system attempted to end a question by burning the questioner. Instead, it transformed him into a symbol. Fire did not end his thought, it broadcast it. To be burned alive is to be used as a lesson, but lessons do not always teach obedience. Sometimes they teach resistance. The same flames meant to enforce silence can illuminate injustice. This is the risk inherent in spectacle. Power must display itself to maintain control, but in doing so, it reveals its fear. A system that is confident in its truth does not need fire. It needs dialogue. Fire appears only when dialogue has failed and authority has nothing left to say. In the end, burning alive is not about death. Death is the smallest part of it. Burning is about fear, memory, and control. It is about telling the living where the boundaries lie. Bruno crossed those boundaries not with violence, but with thought, and fire was used to draw the line where words could not. This video is not about Bruno Giordano. Bruno is only the surface of this story. He is the entry point, not the destination. This video is not about a man who lived centuries ago, nor about the specific doctrines he challenged, nor even about the institution that killed him. Those details matter, but they are not the core. The core is the pattern, the mechanism, the repeated behavior that appears whenever a question threatens certainty. Bruno matters because he reveals how the world reacts when thinking goes beyond permission. He shows what happens when a human being refuses to separate survival from honesty. But the danger he faced did not disappear with him. It changed its language, its tools, its rituals, but not its logic. This video is about how questions are treated when they become inconvenient. It is about how systems respond when explanation is no longer enough to maintain order. It is about how obedience is rewarded, how hesitation is punished, and how refusal becomes unforgivable. Bruno is remembered not because he was unique, but because he was clear. He did not shout. He did not beg. He did not hide his uncertainty behind safer words. He accepted the cost of thinking openly in a world that demanded closure. This video is about that cost, about the silent pressure that teaches people when to stop asking, about the internal negotiation everyone learns to make between curiosity and safety, about the moment when a question feels true but dangerous, and silence feels false but secure. Bruno's death did not end the fear of questions. It refined it. Today, people are rarely burned for asking. They are isolated, discredited, erased, or slowly pushed out of relevance. The fire has become quieter, but it still burns. This video is not asking you to admire a martyr. It is asking you to notice a reflex, to recognize how often comfort is protected at the expense of truth, to see how easily systems convince people that stability matters more than honesty. Bruno's story survives because it exposes something uncomfortable, that the greatest threat to power has never been violence, but clarity. And that clarity, once seen, cannot be unseen. Giordano Bruno is remembered not because of the specific doctrines he held, but because his life reveals a recurring logic that governs how human systems react to uncertainty. At its core, this story is about the conflict between structures that require closure and minds that refuse it. Societies function by reducing complexity. They turn chaos into order by fixing meanings, defining limits, and declaring certain explanations final. This process is not inherently evil. It is how collective life becomes possible. But the moment a system confuses stability with truth, it becomes hostile to anything that reopens questions it has already sealed. Bruno's ideas threatened not because they were fully proven or widely accepted, but because they undermined the psychological need for a center. A centered universe supports centered authority. When the cosmos is finite and ordered, power can claim alignment with that order. When the cosmos becomes infinite, meaning becomes dispersed, and authority loses its metaphysical anchor. The logic is simple and ruthless. If there is no absolute center in reality, then there can be no unquestionable center in human affairs either. Systems cannot tolerate this implication because their legitimacy depends on appearing necessary, natural, and final. Bruno did not attack the system from outside. He exposed a flaw from within. He revealed that certainty was not divine, but constructed. Once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. That is why his trial was not about evidence, correction, or dialogue. It was about restoring the boundary that his thinking had crossed. His refusal to recant mattered more than the content of his beliefs, because recantation would have reaffirmed the system's authority over thought. Without that reaffirmation, punishment became inevitable. Burning was chosen not as justice, but as pedagogy. It was meant to teach observers where questioning ends and obedience begins. This logic repeats across history with different tools and languages. When questions become inconvenient, systems rarely answer them honestly. They label them dangerous, immature, immoral, or irresponsible. They isolate the questioner, drain their credibility, and turn doubt into a personal defect. Over time, people internalize these boundaries. They learn when to stop thinking, not because they are convinced, but because thinking becomes costly. The brilliance and tragedy of Bruno's story is that it makes this mechanism visible. He shows that the greatest threat to power is not rebellion but clarity, not violence but coherence, not denial but refusal to pretend. His death was meant to close a question. Instead, it preserved it. And that is the deeper logic. Systems can destroy bodies, reputations, and voices, but they cannot permanently eliminate the questions that expose their dependence on fear. Bruno matters because he illustrates that truth does not become dangerous when it is false, but when it cannot be controlled.
Justice is powerful in theory, but survival is powerful in practice. When people defend systems that harm them, the explanation is often less ideological and more practical. Livelihood binds loyalty. Economic dependency creates restraint. It is difficult to oppose the structure that pays your salary, provides your housing, supports your family, or secures your future. Resistance becomes a financial gamble, and most individuals cannot afford prolonged uncertainty. Systems understand this dynamic well. They intertwine economic stability with institutional continuity. Employment flows through centralized structures. Promotions depend on visible compliance. Access to opportunity requires alignment. Even in less overtly authoritarian contexts, economic networks are deeply integrated with political and social frameworks. When survival depends on cooperation, dissent feels reckless. The calculation is rarely dramatic. It is quiet and internal. If I speak out, what happens to my job? If I challenge authority, will I lose contracts, clients, access? If instability follows reform, how will my family cope? These are not abstract concerns. They are immediate, tangible risks. Moral conviction competes with material necessity. And material necessity often wins. Economic dependency does not require poverty to function. Even relatively comfortable individuals may feel constrained. Mortgages, loans, education expenses, healthcare costs, modern life is structured around ongoing financial obligation. Systems that provide predictable income and benefits gain leverage. Stability becomes intertwined with personal security. Even if the system is unjust, it is dependable. Dependability is persuasive. This dynamic also fosters gradual accommodation. Small compromises seem rational if they protect income. Minor injustices are tolerated if they preserve employment. Over time, individuals may justify alignment as pragmatism rather than loyalty. I am just doing my job. This is how the system works. I cannot change it anyway. Rationalization softens discomfort and reinforces participation. Dependency can also create hierarchical silence. In workplaces, subordinates hesitate to challenge superiors. In broader society, citizens hesitate to confront institutions that regulate economic life. When power and income are linked, criticism risks more than reputation, it risks livelihood. The more centralized the economic structure, the stronger this effect becomes. There is also the fear of collective collapse. If the system falters, markets may crash. Savings may evaporate. Infrastructure may weaken. Even those dissatisfied with the current structure may fear the cost of transition. Reform can disrupt employment before it improves conditions. The immediate pain of disruption can overshadow the potential long-term benefits of change. People often choose short-term security over uncertain reform. Economic dependency is not purely coercive. It is relational. Individuals rely on coworkers, supervisors, clients, and networks. These relationships are embedded within the system. To resist the system may mean destabilizing personal connections. Thus survival is not only financial but social. Stability protects both income and community. Importantly, dependency can exist even when inequality is evident. Individuals may recognize systemic unfairness yet feel too economically vulnerable to oppose it. They may hope incremental reform will occur without risking their position. Hope becomes a strategy for maintaining both moral self-image and financial safety. History shows that major systemic shifts often occur only when economic dependency weakens or when large numbers experience simultaneous insecurity. Collective hardship can reduce individual risk because resistance becomes shared. But as long as dependency is fragmented and individualized, silence persists. Each person feels alone in their risk calculation. The paradox is clear: systems endure not only because they are powerful, but because they are economically integrated into everyday life. Resistance requires more than moral clarity, it requires alternative stability. Without a viable path that preserves survival, opposition feels irresponsible. Ultimately, economic dependency reveals the tension between ethics and necessity. It does not mean people lack courage. It means they must weigh consequences. When survival overrides resistance, it is not always endorsement. It is calculation. And as long as systems remain intertwined with livelihoods, that calculation will continue to favor stability over confrontation, even when harm is visible. Hope is one of the most powerful human emotions. It sustains people through crisis, hardship, and uncertainty. It allows individuals to endure pain today because they believe tomorrow may be better. But hope has a paradoxical side. When directed toward reform within a harmful system, it can unintentionally extend the life of that system. The belief that improvement is just around the corner often delays decisive change. Most people do not defend harmful systems because they believe the system is perfect. They defend it because they believe it can improve. This is temporary. The next leader will fix it. This policy is flawed, but it will be corrected. These thoughts soften dissatisfaction. They transform anger into patience. Instead of demanding structural transformation, individuals wait for adjustment. Waiting preserves stability. Hope reduces urgency. If people believe reform is possible without rupture, they postpone confrontation. They accept incremental promises. They interpret partial reforms as signs of progress. Even small symbolic changes can reignite optimism. The system gains time. Time allows it to adapt, reframe, or absorb criticism without fundamentally altering its structure. Leaders often understand the power of hope. Announcing reforms, launching commissions, promising modernization. These actions create perception of movement. Even when change is slow or limited, the appearance of reform reassures the population. Citizens who might otherwise push for deeper transformation remain invested in the process. They choose to believe that evolution is safer than revolution. The paradox deepens when reform genuinely begins. Limited openness can expose flaws while simultaneously convincing people that the system is self-correcting. This belief strengthens attachment. See, individuals say, it can change. Criticism becomes integrated into the system rather than directed against it. Dissent is channeled into manageable pathways. The structure remains intact. Hope also protects identity. It allows individuals to maintain loyalty while acknowledging imperfection. If reform is possible, then supporting the system is not immoral, it is constructive. People can defend the broader framework while criticizing specific elements. This balanced stance feels responsible and moderate. Radical rejection then appears extreme. Yet hope can mask depth of structural rigidity. When foundational problems require transformation rather than adjustment, incremental reform may be insufficient. But as long as belief in gradual improvement persists, momentum for deeper change weakens. Individuals tell themselves that patience is wiser than disruption. Over time, patience becomes normalization. The hope paradox is particularly powerful in long-standing systems. When a structure has survived decades, its capacity to adapt seems proven. Each crisis overcome reinforces belief in resilience. Reform cycles become part of the narrative. People assume that this time, too, adjustment will restore equilibrium. Even mounting evidence of fragility can be reframed as temporary turbulence. However, hope has limits. When promised reform repeatedly fails to deliver substantive improvement, trust erodes. The same force that once prolonged the system can accelerate its decline. Disillusionment is sharper than dissatisfaction. When hope collapses, cynicism rises quickly. Citizens who once waited patiently may withdraw support suddenly. Systems that rely on gradual optimism can find themselves destabilized when belief disappears. This reveals the delicate balance within the hope paradox. Hope sustains stability by postponing rupture. But prolonged postponement increases structural strain. If reform is delayed too long, accumulated frustration may overwhelm incremental solutions. The very patience that once protected the system becomes exhausted. Ultimately, hope is neither purely positive nor purely negative. It is a stabilizing force. It prevents reckless collapse. It allows societies to evolve gradually. But when hope is misaligned with reality, when belief in reform replaces honest evaluation, it can prolong harm. The question is not whether hope is valuable. It is whether hope is grounded. If reform is genuine and structural, hope strengthens resilience. If reform is symbolic and superficial, hope becomes anesthesia. It numbs urgency while the underlying condition worsens. And this is the paradox. People defend harmful systems not only because they fear change, not only because they depend on stability, not only because of identity, but because they believe change can occur without rupture. As long as that belief survives, the system survives with it. The illusion of later is one of the most powerful ways turning points disappear. Later feels harmless. It feels thoughtful, careful, responsible. It does not sound like refusal. It sounds like maturity. People tell themselves they are not rejecting action, only postponing it. They believe they are waiting for better conditions, more information, clearer signs. This belief soothes the mind. It removes urgency without creating guilt. Waiting feels wiser than acting, especially when action carries risk. But later is rarely a real moment in time. It is a psychological shelter. A way to avoid the cost of decision while preserving the image of good intention. Every system that benefits from passivity encourages this illusion. Not directly, not aggressively, but gently. There is always a reason why now is not the right time. The situation is too complex. The stakes are too high. People are not ready. Change must be gradual. Stability must be protected. Each reason sounds reasonable on its own. None of them sound immoral. Together, they create permanent delay. The mind accepts this because delay feels reversible. One can always act later. This belief is comforting. It creates the illusion of control without demanding courage. The danger of later is that it turns time into a substitute for responsibility. People begin to trust time itself to fix what action avoids. They believe problems will resolve naturally, that systems will self-correct, that progress is inevitable. History does not support this belief. Time does not correct injustice. It normalizes it. What persists without resistance becomes familiar. What becomes familiar stops feeling urgent. Delay allows harm to blend into everyday life. People adapt to conditions they once would have resisted. Each day without action lowers the threshold of what feels unacceptable. Later also protects identity. Acting early risks being wrong, overreacting, standing alone. Waiting allows a person to feel cautious rather than afraid. If things improve, waiting looks wise. If things worsen, responsibility can be shared. Everyone waited. No one feels uniquely accountable. This diffusion of responsibility is psychologically attractive. It reduces shame. It reduces exposure. But it also ensures that when action finally feels unavoidable, it is no longer easy. Early action is lonely but flexible. Late action is collective but desperate. Another reason later is so persuasive is that it rarely feels like surrender. It feels temporary. But temporary decisions repeated consistently become permanent outcomes. Each postponed response strengthens the structure that caused the problem. Power consolidates while people wait. Habits form. Rules solidify. Resistance becomes more costly. By the time people realize that later has arrived, the conditions that once made change possible are gone. What remains is reaction, not choice. The illusion of later also reshapes moral language. Urgency is reframed as recklessness. Patience is reframed as wisdom. Those who act early are labeled extreme, emotional, unrealistic. Those who wait are praised as balanced and responsible. Over time, people internalize this framing. They learn to distrust their own sense of urgency. They silence discomfort by calling it impatience. This is how conscience is trained to wait until it no longer matters. History shows a consistent pattern. The moment when action would have required the least sacrifice is always in the past. The moment when action becomes obvious is always costly. Later creates the gap between those two moments. It delays response until the price of delay exceeds the fear of action. And when people finally look back, they say the same thing every time. We thought there would be more time. There almost never is. Throughout history, systems have fallen. Empires have dissolved. Governments have collapsed. Ideologies have faded. Yet before any structure breaks externally, something shifts internally. The collapse of a system rarely begins with invasion or revolution. It begins in perception. It begins in silence. It begins in the quiet calculations individuals make between justice and stability. People do not defend harmful systems because they crave harm. They defend them because those systems provide order. Because identity is intertwined with structure. Because change feels uncertain. Because isolation feels dangerous. Because income feels fragile. Because hope whispers that reform is coming. These forces are not signs of weakness. They are reflections of human nature. Stability over justice. Identity over discomfort. Normalization over resistance. Belonging over truth. Survival over confrontation. Hope over rupture. Each of these choices is understandable. Each is rational in isolation. But layered together, they create endurance. Systems do not survive solely through coercion. They survive through participation. Through adaptation. Through the quiet decision to wait. The unsettling truth is this: harmful systems often appear strongest when they are most normalized. When injustice feels routine. When silence feels wise. When reform feels just close enough to postpone change. Power is not only enforced from above. It is reinforced from below. Yet history also shows that belief is not permanent. When hope collapses into disillusionment, when silence breaks into shared voice, when identity detaches from structure, systems shift rapidly. What once seemed unchangeable can transform in months. The same psychology that prolonged endurance can accelerate collapse. This is not a story about villains and victims alone. It is a story about human instinct. About the tension between safety and courage. About the cost of belonging. About the difficulty of choosing uncertainty over familiarity. The real question is not why people defend harmful systems in the past. The real question is how often we do it without noticing. How often we rationalize discomfort as normal. How often we wait for someone else to act first. How often we choose predictability over principle. Because systems are not abstract machines. They are living networks of human decisions. Every act of silence strengthens them. Every act of reflection challenges them. Every calculation between fear and fairness shapes their future. The most dangerous moment is not when a system becomes oppressive. It is when it becomes ordinary. And the most powerful shift does not begin in institutions. It begins in perception. When people stop defending what harms them, structures change. Until then, they endure.